Welcome to Virtual Book Signing, which is hosted here in our bookshop at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. Today, we are hosting two fine Lincoln authors. The first, to my immediate right, is Brian Dirck, who's an associate professor of history at Anderson University. He teaches and writes about the Civil War and military history. He's the author of Lincoln and Davis, Imagining America 1809 to 1865, and now with Lincoln the Lawyer from the University of Illinois Press. This is the first book to base itself extensively on the Lincoln Legals project in Springfield. And he's also the editor of Lincoln Emancipated, The President and Politics of Race from Northern Illinois University Press. And Phillip Paludan, who is here with us as well, is a contributor to this book. Each of these is important enough to the Lincoln story to be included now in the Essential Lincoln Bookshelf list that you'll find on our website, www.alincolnbookshop.com. As I mentioned, Phil Paludan already is joining us as well, one of our major and long-standing Lincoln scholars. And he has the Naomi Lynn Distinguished Chair of Lincoln Studies down in Springfield at the University of Illinois, and is the author of a number of important Lincoln and Civil War studies, including this book, The Presidency of Abraham Lincoln, which won the 1995 Lincoln Prize for the year's outstanding book on the Civil War era. His current work focuses on Lincoln's views of race, democracy, and compassion. And as I mentioned, he's a contributor to the Lincoln Emancipated, and he and Brian both will be signing this book tonight. And as well, Phil will sign copies of the Presidency book if you would like. This is not a first edition. It was a 1994 book, but it is new and still in print, I'm happy to say, and it deserves to be. But Phil will sign that one as well. As is our custom here, we're going to ask each of our authors to first say a few words about their books and about what they've done. So if you'd start out and give us a few words about the book that you've just come out with, Lincoln the Lawyer, please go ahead.
Well, I developed an interest in Lincoln's law practice when I wrote my first book, Lincoln and Davis, because I found that it was a relatively, and I stress relatively, neglected area of Lincoln's life, insofar as you can call anything about Lincoln neglected. It's an area that most scholars either didn't want to deal with or dealt with in a perfunctory fashion, which is, I think, a problem, because he is, I think, by far the most experienced trial lawyer we have ever put in the White House. Over half of our presidents have been attorneys, but a great many of them were just barely attorneys and went into public service very quickly. Abraham Lincoln, on the other hand, used the law as his primary means to earn a living, and as I argue in this book, this is the primary way in which he met most of the people that he knew in Illinois. And I found that nobody had really followed out the implications of this. What does it do to Lincoln to be a lawyer on a day-to-day basis? When he meets people in this context, what lessons does he learn about the way people interact and the way communities should function? And this is part of sort of a larger research agenda that I have in investigating the Civil War, nation building, and community structures during the war itself. And I took advantage of the Lincoln Legal Papers Project database, which is a DVD-ROM database containing over 90,000 documents related to the Lincoln law practice. It was compiled over a decade worth of work in Illinois, where its volunteers and assistants combed every courthouse in Illinois, getting all the scraps of paper on Lincoln's practice. So it was, first of all, I think unique in that it puts the law practice at the heart of who Lincoln is. It's not a peripheral thing. To me, I argue some essential aspects of his character come out through his law practice. And then second of all, it's among the first books to take advantage of this database, which gives us several thousand, not just a few, but several thousand new cases that we never knew about until they were gathered. The database itself is a wonderful database, but it's not been used all that much yet. So I was able to use the database to comb some brand new data. And to answer your other question, I think that's one of the primary differences between this and earlier studies of Lincoln. As you said, John Frank's book, Lincoln the Lawyer in 1961, is an excellent book. It's wonderful. It's the best book I had seen. Duff's was good as well. But they could not have taken advantage of the data that we now have. And most of what they did was anecdotal. Most of it held just a few cases up to the light and talked about them. And what I really wanted to do in this book was to look at the lesser known cases that had sort of escaped historian scrutiny. As far as Henry Whitney's book and Billy Herndon's books, those are primary sources and they have their uses. Especially with Whitney, it's pretty useful, but you have to take it with a grain of salt. Same thing with Billy Herndon. If you know anything about Lincoln, Billy is useful in some things, less so in others. So I think the primary contribution here is we're getting new data that we simply did not have before to go look at Lincoln's law practice.
Yeah, the first look at Lincoln's entire practice for once, and the breadth of it, which we really didn't understand. Actually, the depth of it as well.
Oh yeah.
Duff's book I like for the anecdotal. I mean, it's very nice on the circuit, and Whitney the same way. Although all of a sudden Lincoln disappears and Napoleon comes in for numbers of pages. John Frank's I like because it's really a good case study of his Springfield law practice, and so that I think holds up. Although probably some of his conclusions might go adrift with the new things that you're coming up with. Well, thank you, Brian. We'll be talking a great deal throughout this signing. Sometimes we may forget to sign books, we'll be talking so much, but we'll try to get to your books as well as we get to them. Now, Lincoln Emancipated, which you, Brian, edited, and Phil, you have one of the major essays in here. I want to just read, before I ask you to make a few comments, I just want to read really the last paragraph almost of your essay. Lincoln was not a one-dimensional man. His occasional racist remarks revealed everything from the instinctual bias of a childhood in pro-slavery territory to the careful efforts of a subtle politician to achieve a radical goal by wrapping it in conservative bunting. As a result of Abraham Lincoln's efforts, slavery, the foundation of war and American racism, began its death march. It was a march that began with the debates with Douglas and was followed by Lincoln's election, his request to the border states to end slavery, his signing every act of Congress hostile to slavery, his first Emancipation Proclamation, the second proclamation, the use of American troops, the move to get reconstructing states to adopt black voting, the demand for the 13th Amendment, not to mention being the first American president to invite blacks to the White House and publicly calling Douglas my friend. Worse things have come from racists. And that's the point that I would like to make out of here and have you comment on. What points do others as well make in this book? There are a number of essays. And what marked differences in their conclusions might you see from yours?
I didn't see an awful lot of differences. I think we were all responding to a book that came out a couple of years ago by Lerone Bennett called Forced into Glory, or some words to that effect. Which basically branded Abraham Lincoln as a racist. He had written something about that in 1969 and got a flurry of responses. We thought this was a more thoughtful and more scholarly kind of response to whether or not you could say that Abraham Lincoln was a racist. In dealing first of all with the question of what do you say when you say somebody is a racist. It's a kind of an equation between that person and racism that clouds a lot more than it reveals. And it points out the problem with using the word is. I was a former president used to comment a lot. But the book talks about such things as reparations, how Lincoln might feel about reparations for slavery. It talks about colonization, the idea of sending the blacks out of this country, which Bennett takes as his prime example of Lincoln's racism, that he wanted a white America. It deals with the complexity of local politics and shows how Lincoln had to balance things that he very often didn't quite understand, but he had to deal with the politics of the state of Missouri, for example. And such issues as where do you spot Lincoln's, the greatest place where people accuse Lincoln of racism, and see what the actual documentation is. And getting Lincoln and race together in the same package does bring two major issues before us. The problem of race, as Du Bois said, is the problem of the 20th century. But it apparently still goes on when you start talking about basketball players and former talk show hosts. But the problem goes back to 1619, when the first blacks were purchased by the colonists at Jamestown, leading up to and causing the Civil War. And Lincoln, the great emancipator, but emancipating not only the blacks, but helping to emancipate the white population. People often talked about, well, there's a problem with, there's the black problem. Well, to the blacks, there's no black problem, there's a white problem. And Lincoln's job was not only to free the slaves, but to free the republic, and to do that in a context where it would make progress, not simply be a shout in the night. So this book takes some pretty thoughtful looks, I think, at Lincoln's race attitudes toward Native Americans, which doesn't necessarily show Lincoln in his best light. He had one major encounter with them. They came to the White House, and he gave them a little lecture on the differences between white people and red people. This during the Civil War, and one of the major differences he points out is that Indians are more likely to be bloodthirsty than white people are. What the Indians thought of that in the middle of a 620,000 death war, I don't know, but they must have thought that the white man the gods must be crazy. So this is an abiding issue with probably our best thinker on the question of where race fits into the constitutional system, into the political system. It's good to have this kind of answer because what we think about Lincoln has a lot to do with what our possibilities are. Mm-hmm. And people know that, in that you can go to the Alabama Ku Klux Klan webpage and they will be quoting Abraham Lincoln on their behalf.
Everyone does, and everyone has.
Yeah, everyone must get right with Lincoln, as David Donald said.
Exactly, it's correct. This book, Lincoln Emancipated, The President and the Politics of Race, has a foreword by Alan Guelzo and other essays by Kenneth Winkle and James Leiker, also Michael Vorenberg on reparations, and Dennis Bowman on All Politics Are Local, mainly emancipation in Missouri. And you, Brian, have an excellent chapter in here on Lincoln emancipation in the Supreme Court, which I think everyone should read. These two especially are the two essays in here, if Ken Winkle isn't listening, that one should really read first.